In this video, I will talk about the making of the video on wages and prices in the long run. If you missed that video, there is a link up there and you can watch it before enjoying the data nerdy stuff we are going to discuss in this video. First, I spoke about the cost of living crisis. And I used Google Trends to illustrate the starting point of the cost of living crisis. Now, Google Trends is a great source for data analysis. You can simply Google it. You go to Google Trends, you can put in search terms and you can impose certain restrictions. So you might like to restrict yourself to a certain area like finance, for instance. And you can also, most importantly, download the data. So you see the download button here, you just hit this and you can download the data as a CSV file. So if you watched other videos, I'm a big fan of CSV files because I can easily move it into Python or Stata. I can work with it in many applications. So that's quite a useful starting point. Next, I used macroeconomic data, and I show you a database which is for free, and I like free stuff. It's always good to have free stuff, and it's really powerful if you want to do long-term analysis. There is a database which is really good for long-term analysis of macroeconomic conditions, and it's called a Millenium of macroeconomic data. So here we have a detailed description of various time series. So I explored this part of the data set, in particular the real wage data. Next, I used various data provided by the ONS, so the Office for National Statistics. And we've mainly focused on issues around seasonal adjusted pay, various retail price indices, and sub-indices, in particular for bread and energy, which I also used. And again, it's all for free. It's easy to download as a CSV file or as a normal Excel file. Usually when I try to combine various data sources, I do this either in Stata directly or I use Excel, and this depends very much on the complexity of the data. So honestly, if it's only a handful of time series, it's a lot easier just to copy paste into Excel and organize your data in this way. Once things become a little bit more dicey, I prefer moving into Stata or potentially Python. Now, Python in particular is very powerful if I use APIs to get and download my data, which I have done in many other videos. So in here, I organized my data for my video. So I put in here all the different sources and definitions. This is always a really good idea because I promise you will otherwise forget. And in particular, if you combine various data sources, it's essential that you take a moment to note down the definitions and the different sources. The issue with the Bank of England dataset is it stops in 2016. So you have to try to extend it. The trouble you always have is that alternative time series might be slightly off. So based on the Bank of England data, we refer to the ONS series and we give also the ONS series code. I use the same ONS series code, but as you will see, they don't 100% match. So if you look at this overlapping period and just compare them, you see it's not 100%. It's very close, one has to argue, but there is a tiny bit of a gap, and there are various reasons for that. One reason could be that it might be indexed at a different point in time. So there are lots of reasons why time series don't 100% match. Now, what can you do in this case? How can you use the information provided by the ONS to forecast your original time series. And the best approach here is to use a very simple extrapolation. So there are various ideas you can use. You can try to do this by ratios, look at growth rates, and then use that for forecasting. So in this particular case, I start with the previous value and then I use the growth rate in my ONS time series to do the forecasting. You will see that they move in a very similar pattern as we saw before, but there's a tiny bit of a difference in it. But you preserve that by using this particular extrapolation method, because you refer to the Bank of England time series in 2016 and you then grow this time series using the ONS data. Now in other cases I was able to get a good match with various alternative data sources. So again I combine ONS data and Bank of England data for my price data on bread and electricity. So now I move into Stata because quite often I like to use Stata, once my data is structured in a decent way. So what I have done here is I simply copy paste the Excel file into a Stata file. Now this is straightforward to do. So you just go to Stata and you go to the editor. So you click up here, the data editor, and you can just copy paste straight from Excel. And here it will ask you how to treat the first row of data. In my case, it's variable names. And you see it worked quite nicely. It all looks numeric. Yeah, so when you look at the color of my data, it's all in black, which is good because it's all numeric, and you have some missing data indicated by the dots, which is perfectly fine. So the first things I always strongly recommend is using data labels. So you see I use label var and I specify each and every variable and simply refer to the definitions which you already saw in the Excel file. This is a really good idea. I'm working with many companies and lots of different projects, and it's very frequently the case that people don't label their data, and it becomes an utter nightmare after some time to understand what the data is really about. I simply check using a summarize command and using a describe command, and then I tset my data. Yeah, so here I declare that I have a time series. And as you can see now, it's all looking fine. So the data is read correctly, and I have all the labels defined. So that's a good start. So next I do some very basic calculations. Of course you can argue, well, I can do this in Excel. Yes, you can. But I strongly advise you against it. It's much better to do any calculations in Stata or Python because it's so much easier to replicate. And the main issue is replication of your findings. And that becomes a real headache if you do it in Excel, because in Excel you can easily make mistakes in an equation and you don't notice. Yeah, so here for instance, if I want to change that line, I just change it, I run it again and it's all updated. It's very straightforward. If I want to change a formula in an Excel file, it becomes a nightmare. Yes, I have to adjust the formula, have to redo the calculation, have to then move the data again into Stata and so on. So I never ever do this. I prefer to have all the raw data done in Excel, then move into Stata, move into Python, and once there, I do all the calculations, yeah, because that gives me much better control. So what I do is straightforward, yeah. So I take the wages, so this is nominal wages, and I refer to the price of bread, so to get a relative price. And then I do a simple index construction where I have a starting value at the beginning of the time period, and then I replace the value of my index using now the lag operator. Again, if you want to know more about these time series operators, I just finished an applied time series course, which is available on YUNIKARN.com. At the moment, there is a 50% discount if you use Data Nerd. But it will expire on the 5th of December. So next, again, I use a data label, which is important. I drop this in between relative price because I use it again later. Again, I can do this differently using local variables, but you know, that's easy enough in this case. I do something similar for fuel, so a similar index construction. Once all of that is done, I simply do a line chart where I look now at the development of wages relative to bread prices and energy. So here we are, now we replicated what we have seen in the previous video. Finally, I do a similar analysis for the long-term wages and prices. Now this goes way back into the 13th century, and in this case it doesn't make much sense to merge all the data because the previous data set starts in the 1960s, so it's much shorter, so it doesn't make much sense to combine the two. So I suggest you run a separate analysis. I follow a very similar approach, so again I of course label my data, which is a really good idea. I check everything, I t-set my data, I construct the index. In this case I start indexing at 100. You can do what you want. Before that I used 1, both is perfectly fine. And I construct the real wage index. So here we are, so we have now the log transformed real wage index going all the way back to 1240 something. And of course we have the bump here at the end of the period, but honestly looking at this massive expansion before, it's only a little bump at the moment. Let's see what actually happens next. I see you in the next one.